Hello, welcome to the Beatles Books podcast with me, Joe Wisby. My guest today is David Guerrero, who is here to discuss his book, You Won't See Me, When the Beatles Ghosted Imelda. The story of the Beatles' disastrous 1966 stop in the Philippines is well known, but what's the story behind this famous misstep? How and why did things go so wrong so quickly? David's book drills down in fascinating detail on the Beatles' experience in Manila, giving us a moment-by-moment account of their whole trip and the impact that this short stay had on the Philippines' cultural history. David Guerrero, hello, welcome to the Beatles Books podcast. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. We're here to talk about your fine book, You Won't See Me, When the Beatles Ghosted Imelda. So we'll start by getting a little bit of background on you and on the book itself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the kind of story of the book, the journey of how you got here today.
All right, so I'm a half Filipino, half English advertising copywriter by trade, who basically normally writes 7-word headlines. And I've been inspired to write over 50,000 words on this topic because I sort of got a foot in both camps of this story, and I feel connected to it because this is one of the most high-profile incidents of any kind where the Philippines has come into the lens of sort of global popular culture. And I sort of thought this would be a really interesting thing to examine, not just as a Beatles fan, which I am, but also as someone who lives in the Philippines and someone who understands the country, I think, to some extent, and wants to take the opportunity to use this to have a lens on the country and explain a little bit more about it. So that's how that came out. And then in the short term, this grew out of a radio documentary I presented for the BBC World Service in 2021 called When the Beatles Didn't Meet Imelda. And that's where I did a lot of the primary research. But after that, I wanted to go deeper and turn it into a book. And then I had to sort of learn how to write a book, which was not an easy thing. So yes, that was the next thing I had to do. And pandemic came along, did a master's program and got help from various people. Yes, and it turns out that being a paperback writer is not that easy. And it did indeed take me years to write. That's been a real journey of discovery on all fronts for me. And so at the moment I'm sitting here having just launched the book in Singapore and feeling pretty good of having reached this milestone. And of course the next pinnacle has been appearing on your podcast. So
that is true. Let's start by talking a bit about the background of the Beatles experience there. Many listeners will know the basics of this story. The magic of your book is that it drills down and reveals so much more than certainly I knew. How did the Beatles end up in the Philippines in 1966? Was it a typical country for pop groups to visit in the mid-60s?
I think given if you're going to come to Asia, there were not many choices in 1966. There was Japan, westernized market. There was the Philippines as a former American colony with commercial radio stations, TV stations, all the infrastructure of the pop world sort of required. But if you looked around you, I mean, China was going through a cultural revolution in '66. Vietnam War was going on. Indonesia had banned the Beatles completely, not just the band, but the music, and Thailand wasn't open to it. Malaysia wasn't. Singapore was 1 year old. It had just broken away from Malaysia. So the rest of the region was in turmoil. So if you wanted to come to the Far East, and as it was called, this would have been your choice. Having said that, I think what happened here is that the promoters approached this guy called Vic Lewis, who had recently been absorbed into the NEMS organization. I won't need to tell your listeners what NEMS is, right? So this was his project, and he was approached with this and thought, well, this is good. Top dollar, I mean, the $100,000 fee to come and play one day in Philippines. It'll be an easy trip from Japan, and we can then move on from there. It'll be a nice little earner. I think he even called it that. It was basically he saw it as a business thing, and I think Brian sort of went along with it and just said, "Okay, your show, Vic, get on with it," and that was that.
Were there other pop groups that had been to the Philippines previous to this in the 60s?
Yeah, I mean, there was Matt Monro was the previously come, and almost at the same time, the Zombies were here, and the Zombies played quite a few gigs. And Jane Asher's brother, Peter. Peter and Gordon were had played as well. So actually, Peter had given some less than flattering accounts to Paul before he arrived. So I think Paul was already a little bit wary of what they'd find. But yeah, Peter and Gordon were here. And, there's some story about their misadventures. I think I put in the book about how they were sort of running around with various society matrons and things at the time. So there's all kinds of things happening. But yeah, so it was definitely on the map. I mean, even after the Beatles, the Supremes came. It was a stop.
So, what was the Beatles' reputation like in the Philippines before they arrived? Were they successful there from 63, 64? How well were they known out there?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely massive. The breakthrough for all the fans I spoke to here was I Saw Her Standing There. That was the song that really cut through. And again, as a country where American media was pretty prevalent, there were American bases here at that time, and people could get like American TV channels. So I think a lot of people saw the Ed Sullivan show, and then when I Saw Her Standing There came out, it was on jukeboxes on the radio. There was a dance show on TV called The Nineteeners, and there were dancers who were inventing dances to go with the song. And so people were learning the dances, learning the song, singing it in playgrounds. There were groups, So yes, it was massive, and Philippines is a very musical country anyway. So yeah, I mean, the Beatles' music landed on very fertile ground here. A lot of excitement from that moment on.
Was their arrival trailed like when I had the guys on that wrote the book about the Australian tour? It was like a
Mm.
huge, like the build up was like months before. Was it similar for the Philippines?
Yeah, I mean, so the concert was in July 4, and I think by March it was known about. I mean, I have to go back now, but there was that much, at least that much build up, and there was enough build up for people to start wondering how they'd afford the tickets because the top tickets were priced more than Shea Stadium. So there was a lot of concern about the super fans about how they would afford the tickets. So they were taking in laundry and doing odd jobs and sort of diverting money that was meant for school fees and things like that, and to make sure they'd have enough money. So yes, there was a lot of build up, a lot of anticipation.
Why was it only the one show? Do you know why they didn't do another two or three shows?
Well, it was two shows in one day. I think that was difficult enough. I think it was difficult enough to, I think by the time the promoters worked out how much they'd committed to NEMS, this $100,000, and no joke, trying to raise that. And I think they ended up going to a larger stadium than the one they originally committed to. So
Mm.
originally, and in some books, you'll still see that this was at the Araneta Coliseum, which is an indoor stadium and one that was much more suited for it. That was where the Zombies played, for example. But that was more of a 25,000 seater sort of thing. But the ticket prices they wanted to charge, the owners of that stadium weren't happy with that level of pricing. So they said, no, 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 we want to keep our prices low, and you can't do it here. So they ended up choosing this quite unsuitable large but much larger venue, right? So the Rizal Memorial Football Stadium, which is really a football stadium and completely not constructed for a rock concert of any kind. And so that was but they just had to sell that many tickets, and they knew there'd be the demand, so they just said, okay, we've got to go to this place that's going to make this thing break even, try and make money. I think the other funny thing is the promoter was essentially a businessman whose other business was importing fertilizer into the country. And he'd been sort of persuaded by a business partner that it would be good to get into the music promotion business. And this partner of his saying, yeah, I'll handle all that stuff. You just handle the money side of it, kind of thing. And so they were not that instinctive about or that experienced, and maybe nobody was at that time
Mm.
about how to manage this. Anyway, so they were scrambling to get money, getting the largest possible venue, and then just selling the hell out of it as much as they could.
Okay, so let's drill down a little bit on their arrival. the stuff in the anthology, which we'll come back to, in other bits and bobs that I've read over the years, the sense that I've got from reading that, which wasn't entirely fitted in with your book, is it was kind of chaotic from the second that they landed. What was the schedule like, and was there any sense on the Beatles and their management part that immediately something was odd here when they landed?
Yeah, I mean, this is the extraordinary thing. I mean, as I mentioned, Vic Lewis before had been brought into the NEMS organization, and Brian had essentially been told to buy his company by the US promoter, who felt he owed Vic Lewis something because Vic Lewis originally tipped him off to the Beatles. So he said to Brian Epstein, please buy Vic Lewis's company and bring him in and give him something to do. So Vic Lewis had been to the Philippines on a kind of advanced party and worked out all these details. And he was, in his memoirs, which are still around somewhere, you can find them, they're called Music and Maiden Overs, published in 87. And he talks about how he carefully and somewhat brilliantly arranged, in his words, to have the Beatles plane land as far away from the airport terminal as possible, and then have them get into limousines on the tarmac, do all the arrival stuff on the tarmac, and then be ferried out away from the fans to a highly secure location, a military location, literally in the middle of the city, which is the Navy headquarters. And then, as we will get to, for them to be staying on a boat overnight, so no fans could reach them. But this was all essentially arranged by Vic Lewis. So there's a sense in the anthology of like, oh, we don't know why we were on a boat.
Mm.
The fact is that it was the NEMS representative that had sort of arranged all of this in a kind of way of, thinking that would be a good thing.
So what was that boat like then? How did they, as you said, the anthology, it all sounds a bit kind of confused. So do we think that they didn't get a schedule? What went wrong there?
Again, it was all good intentions. I think it was all about, and all the things that happened were really about this sense that there's hundreds of thousands of rabid fans trying to get to them, as everywhere, and certainly in Manila. And how are you going to keep them safe, keep them away from all that, without having this massive security presence the whole time? And so I think they just thought, look, the easiest thing is going to be to get them all fully away from the city. Put them, again, the boat was some sort of deal with one of the media sponsors. So it was owned by the guys who, among other things, owned one of the TV stations, some of the radio network. So it was like, okay, we'll house them on our luxury yacht, and in return we'll have some exclusive interviews on the boat, kind of thing. So that was a sort of deal. I don't know what other deal there was, but that was the essential deal. But this was all pre-announced, and there was headlines in the newspapers about, if you want to see the Beatles, you're going to have to swim, man. That was the headline, right? And it was just this whole somewhat James Bondy cloak and dagger thing of, there was rumors they're going to be put on a helicopter, flown to the boat. That there would be this. I mean, you get the sense this is where the inspiration for Yellow Submarine might have come from. But of course, it was recorded before they arrived. But it was something a bit odd about that. But it was all oddness that came out of arrangements made by the NEMS representatives.
So let's talk about the shows themselves then. There is some footage I looked the other day, because you mentioned the book that there was no deal struck, unfortunately, for the whole shows to be filmed. But there is a few seconds of video from the shows.
Yeah.
Why weren't they filmed? I mean, that would have been a huge money maker, surely.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big differences between the Philippines and Japan. I mean, in Japan, and if you've seen, the Japan coverage is incredible in that there's even footage of every minute of the transfer from the airport to the hotel in a following car. There's nothing of them, but that's just their car, and you're following all the way through. So everything was covered in Japan. The concerts were in color, and the Philippines. The reality is that, again, it was a former American colony, and all the TV stations are privately owned. So there's no state broadcaster. They were all owned by these, what should we call them? The big corporations, sort of private corporations,
Mm.
mainly family-owned corporations, but corporations nonetheless. So none of them exist in the form they were in today. Okay, so they've gone through multiple changes of ownership, franchises, and in between there's been, should we call it martial law, sort of forcible changes of ownership, forcible share dividends. So essentially, the same people don't own them, and there was not, I think, given what happened afterwards, a big appetite for preserving that particular footage. Actually, you go back, you can't find. It's very hard to find any footage. I mean, the memory, collective memory, has not been well preserved. And even you might find a few ads from the day, which have been preserved maybe by the corporations, the advertisers themselves, or the agencies. But yeah, no one's preserved that stuff, and it's not entirely surprising because again, the archiving is not great. I'm hoping that at some point in the promotion or the launch of this book, somebody will come up and say, I've got it. I've got some, and it's in the basement. It's in the attic. It's in my uncle's boot of his car or something. And I hope it'll show up. But as of now, it's not around.
Mm. What was the reaction to the concerts themselves? Harking back to an anthology, but there's the sense that the Beatles themselves couldn't believe the number of people there.
When we got there, it was like the Monterey Pop Festival. I mean, it was just millions. There was 200,000 people in that site. And somebody was thinking, well, this promoter is probably making a bit on the side out of this. I remember that was the feeling.
What was the kind of response at the shows?
Again, all the fans that were there were absolutely thrilled about it, and they were just going nuts. And I mean, there were some. If there were complaints, it was about the sound system. You couldn't hear much. The drinks weren't chilled, or and perhaps worst of all, in terms of the organization, one of the guards on the ticket gate just went on a break, at some point before the last show, and there were just crowds of people trying to get in, and no one had the key to the
Wow.
And so the police came along and actually just kind of opened up the gates to stop overcrowding and to sort of stop anything bad happening. So no one quite knows how many people got in at the second show, because they just kind of let everybody in just to ease the bottleneck. So yes, that could have been organized a lot better. But again, people were just happy to be there. They were just amazed to see them. They weren't really too worried about all of that.
Mm.
I mean, the sort of show that you would have got then contrasts quite a lot with the kind of shows that you get now, which is, sort of 2-hour multi-sensory experiences with coordinated wristbands and things like that. This was 30 minutes. You got 30 minutes of the Beatles, 10 songs, and actually apparently not a lot of banter in between. It was just, thank you very much, and the next one is.
Wow.
It wasn't like a lot of connection with the crowd. It seems that was one of the reviews of it. Yeah.
Why do you think that was? Do you think that was because there were so many people, or they felt uncomfortable at that point, or have you got any sense of that at all?
I think it was just, I mean, it was hot. It was, I mean, it was an unfamiliar place, I think, for the band. I mean, it was just, where are we? Why are there so many people there? Maybe they had no idea. I think they weren't really briefed at all on where they were going. I mean, it was just, there was very little knowledge. And this is one of the problems Philippines faced and maybe continues to face, is that there's not a lot of knowledge or understanding, just even the basics about the country, that there was, it's 7,000 plus islands, or that there's this, however many people it was at that time, 30 million people, so it wasn't any knowledge about that. So if they'd known, they wouldn't have been surprised that there were 50,000 people turning up for their evening concert, after 30,000 in the morning, in the afternoon. But it was just, a lack of knowledge, and just like, it's another place, we're turning up, we're playing this thing. They'd done over 1,000 concerts by that time.
Mm.
So this was just another one, but it was the one that wasn't like the other ones. And it was the one, as I was saying, the tour date to end all tour dates.
Before we go on to talk about the ghosting, to reference the title of your
Yes.
book, can you tell us a little bit about the Marcoses themselves. What was the history of them? What kind of personalities were they?
Okay, I mean, if looked at from the perspective of today, Ferdinand Marcos was in power for 20 years from 1965, end of 65 to the beginning of 86. And for the final, at the beginning of that time, he was a democratically elected leader, just been elected December 65, and would be re-elected in 69. But in 72, just before he would have to step down, he declared something called martial law, which essentially suspended elections and gave him sort of overall power from the country in a kind of unelected state, often called a dictatorship at that point. And it was, and I think fair to say from 72 onwards, that's what it was. But and that's where all the notoriety and all the abuses and all the corruption is sort of coming from that second part of their regime. Not to say that the first part was entirely unblemished either, but I think that just looking at that historical moment of July 66, they'd just been elected. So December 65, they'd been elected. Imelda was a big part of getting her husband elected. She went on campaign trail with him, used to sing to the crowds, people were sort of fell in love with this idea of this youngish couple taking over the presidency of the country. And I think they were all the previous ones had been pretty old, and I think this was someone seen as they were, even in America they were described as the Jackie and JFK of Asia, right? This was this idea that they were this hopeful new pairing, and especially because Vietnam was going on and America was desperate to find some democratic kind of role models that they could pin their hopes on. That was the hope. It didn't go that way at all, but that was how they started off. So in the year, the moment the Beatles turned up, still very early on, people were generally giving them, generally liking the Marcoses. I mean, the population was not unhappy with them at that moment. It was still pretty popular, I think. But this was a moment that showed people that maybe not everything was all right as well. And this is a moment that kind of turned for some, certainly some of the younger members of the country population, just thought, okay, this is not good. It's a bad sign.
What can you tell us about the actual event itself that the Beatles were supposed to attend? You mentioned Vic Lewis earlier. Was he involved in this? What can you tell us about the genesis of the so-called snubbing?
Understandably, and I think in the weeks leading up to the Beatles' arrival, I think Imelda was thinking it would be pretty good to have the Beatles over to the palace and to have a photo op and just to give them a welcome, a special welcome, to the country and to show how much we value their visit, blah blah blah. So at some point that must have been made known to the promoters, or someone around them said, can we make this happen? And there were efforts made by the promoters, and again, it's contradictory as to how these efforts were made, but there were definitely telegrams sent and envoys sent. Peter Brown talks about, he didn't mention it in his first book, but now in his latest book, he's now talking about Philippine ambassador to Japan apparently coming along to the Tokyo Hilton and inviting Brian and to bring the band to the palace, to which, again, only recently he's saying that he turned them down and said that he absolutely wouldn't do it. But it is odd that a week before, Imelda's inviting 300 people. There are catering laid on, there are journalists invited, there's an orchestra. There's a lot of preparation gone into this grand welcome, which ostensibly is very well meaning. You've got, let's give them a big welcome. On the other hand, of course, they're going to get something out of it. They're going to be standing next to the four most famous musicians in the world, and they're hugely popular in the Philippines. And this is going to be good for the regime. This is going to be good for them politically. It was just seen as a good idea at the time, and everyone was very excited about it. I've talked to people who were invited that day. They were trying to decide what to wear. They were coming along with their cameras, making sure they had extra roll of film, new flash bulbs, whatever. They were all very excited about it. And of course, They were expected at 11 o'clock, 11:30, they hadn't arrived. 12 o'clock, there were rumors about, are they coming? Are they not coming? They're not on the boat anymore, apparently. They're in the hotel.
We're not stuffing in some sort of royal reception, you know. They really want you to come. And we said no. And it became a point of principle. So we had to stick to it once we got that far into it.
But they're not coming. What's going on? And the palace had sent a delegation to the hotel to pick them up. And this is where it really started to go wrong, because Vic Lewis at that point was saying, look, Brian, I think it's a good idea if we go. And he said, these people are hot-headed. We don't know what they're going to do if we don't go. The British embassy is ringing up Brian saying, look, you really should go, because you have no idea how much they control, how powerful they are. And he goes like, yeah, I don't care about that. We're not going, and that's it. So there was just a 1-hour standoff in the hotel between the representative from the palace, who didn't feel like going back to the palace saying they're not coming, and Epstein basically saying, absolutely not, we're not going. And there was one exchange, and you can just imagine this kind of banter going on, where the palace representative says, we need you to come and play a special performance for the First Lady at the palace. And one of the Beatles, and we can all imagine maybe who it was, but they said, if she wants a special performance, she can come up to our room and we'll give her a special performance up there. Right? And that was said, it was recorded in one of Imelda's biographies. And then when that was relayed to the guy whose job it was to handle security, he said, can you imagine what they said? What do they mean by that? What do you do in a bedroom anyway? This is an insult, not just to the First Lady, but to all Filipino women. So he's got it was a very macho thing of getting very hot-headed about this. I mean, I think Vic Lewis was right about that, at least, that would rile this guy up quite a lot. So while they were going off to play the concert, there's a kind of subcurrent of official disgruntled security guys. One of them talks to a newspaper columnist, and the columnist said, well, what are you going to do about it? And and he goes, well, I'm going to go and beat them up when they leave at the airport tomorrow. And he goes, I'll bet you 1 peso that you won't do it. So he kind of goaded him into it, and he said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. So that was end of that act. We know that something is going to happen.
Yeah, because it is. Your book runs like a play almost, because we're moving on to the sort of the final act now, where things are starting to go really awry. How quickly did that atmosphere around the Beatles change? Was it an instant thing? Was it a gradual thing over those few hours? What were the obvious signs that things were not good at this point?
Yeah, I think it would have been pretty quick from the official side, and I think it would have taken a while for it to seep through into the awareness of the management. Okay, so they're seeing a few worrying things on TV when they, in between the concerts, because the band's staying in the stadium, but I think possibly Tony Barrow or someone goes back to the hotel, watches a bit of TV, see some worrying coverage about Beatles didn't show up, Beatles snubbed the first family, it doesn't look good. And then they notice that from the stadium back to the hotel, there's no security, or there's very little security, and there's sort of menacing looking crowds coming around the car. That's not good either. By the time they get to the hotel, no security. Again, Vic Lewis is taken away by the police and interrogated overnight with what he calls a Peter Lorre type figure, who keeps saying to him, why did you insult the First Lady? Why did you not go to the palace? Because they're pinning it on him, because he's the guy who came and make the advance arrangements. So he's seen as the face of it. And he just keeps saying, we didn't mean to, there was no intention to do this, we didn't know. And he just kept, and it was just a sort of back and forth. And they sort of kept him almost overnight, and they let him go in the morning. I don't think the others were particularly bothered by the fact that Vic Lewis was taken away. They probably didn't mind. There was a party going on in the hotel that Mal Evans describes in his memoirs, which was quite a debaucherous party going on in the hotel, not necessarily including the band, but including all of the entourage. The band themselves have a surprise visit from a group of fans who take advantage of the fact they didn't know the security wasn't there, but they just decided to take a chance and go to the hotel and find out where the Beatles are staying. And then they just luck their way in to sort of spend a few minutes talking to them and getting close to them. And this is something that they still remember. They'll still get back together and talk about it. So that was a nice interlude for them. But of course, as a short interlude before the next day dawns, and as you'll see in the anthology, Ringo says they call for breakfast and it doesn't show up. And they get the newspapers and they see all these splashy headlines about Beatles snubbing the first family, etc. And then I think there's a radio interviewer who comes up and says, why didn't you go? What happened? So they're already getting questioned by the media at this point.
That airport scene then, the image that we have is of them dashing through the airport trying to find that safety of the British Airways flight. How accurate is that? How much danger do you think they were actually in? Would they have been attacked? Would they have been not allowed to board that flight home? What was the reality of that moment at the airport?
I think there was not real danger. I think there was just this atmosphere of, again, imagine the security guy who's made a bet that he would give them a hard time at the airport. There's also Imelda's brother, who has been, again, similarly goaded into doing something by his friends. And so there's just a thing of like, we don't want to do too much, but we want to do something. At the same time, there's an overwhelming majority of fans who are at the airport, who some of whom are worried. Some of whom are now worried that somebody might do something stupid at the airport. So the head of the fan club, this lady, Josie Leorada, who decides Waits has had an official meet and greet with Paul and George in the Manila Hotel, knows it's time for them to go, and waits until they go, and then follows them in a taxi. And so she follows the band to the airport just because she's worried that something might happen. And she gets to the airport just behind them and sees, as Ringo's going into the departure lounge, that there's some menacing looking guys making their way towards him. So she gets in between the thugs and Ringo and sort of gives him a push. And she's a tiny 19-year-old girl at this point. She gives him a push through the door to get him in to safety. And she says that inside it's totally quiet. There's nothing going on. So it's perfectly possible that Ringo might have thought he was being pushed by somebody menacing, but he was just being pushed by one of the fans. So I don't know. I mean, she's quite clear that when she looks into the airport, there's nothing untoward happening inside the terminal. However, there's no question that there were people out there to make it uncomfortable. I think it's more about some trying to show displeasure without causing anything too bad to happen. I think there was just the one person that seems to have been kicked or whatever is Alf Bicknell, the driver. But apart from that, there's, and I think there's obviously pretty unpleasant atmosphere. And as John was saying, would treat you like ordinary passengers, and all that kind of thing. And being maybe, shunted around the airport. And so obviously it's designed to intimidate, but I don't think there was any real physical danger. However, that's scary it must have been.
Yeah. So they get home and then they do these interviews in, I think it's Skyways Hotel in England that are used in anthology, and some of which are seen elsewhere as well.
Well, how frightened were you, George?
Terrified, I'd say. Yeah, it was very bad. There was about 5 sort of real big, sort of funny-looking fellas with guns and all the rest of the gear.
Who did all the kicking?
Yeah, and they just had arranged. It was so obvious they'd arranged to give us the worst time possible. Before we arrived at the airport.
They're pretty scathing in those interviews straight away. They clearly feel like they've got maybe an axe to grind, I don't know, but like you said, John's ordinary passenger quote is a typically great John quote. 2 questions there. Do you think that they were misled or misunderstood the level of danger that they were in and their experience as a whole? And how quickly did those interviews get back to the Philippines? Was there a sense that, were the fans disappointed that the Beatles have reacted like that to being in their country?
Well, I mean, it's important to say the fans didn't care at all that the Beatles didn't go to the palace. In fact, I mean, most of the letters in the papers were like, nobody has, an invitation is not a command, and most fans are 100% behind the Beatles all the way. The official, the sort of elites who are actually the ones that are offended, and they pick up on some of those interviews, but they don't get too upset. But it's a bit of a joke by that point, and they're just laughing at themselves. And that's like, so there was one that I think the famous quote was, "If we ever go back there, it'll be with an H bomb." I think that might have been George, I think, and then, but one of them says, columnists were saying, well, Philippines have become nuclear power because if the Beatles say if they come back, they'll bring an H bomb. This being a pre-digital, pre-globalized age, they was just so far apart. Everything was so local. I mean, no one's seeing half of this stuff. It takes a long time for information to get around. So, yeah, I don't think there was a lot of reaction to it. I mean, the Marxists made an apology immediately, which nobody really paid any attention to. At the time, the responses were a lot more polite and nuanced than they became. I think even with the Beatles Monthly, there was the editor was saying the boys would like to make it clear that it was only a few troublemakers at the airport and the rest of the fans were lovely and all this kind of thing. So I think that nuance was lost over time, right? And over time, it just became Ringo, I hated the Philippines, and I think for Filipinos, it just became a bit of an embarrassment. It just became like, how could we have had the world's greatest band here and messed it up? There was a kind of embarrassment, but more at the leaders than at the fan level. The fans are like, just the whole thing seemed incomprehensible. So yeah, I think the main thing is that to some extent the leaders and the fans have got conflated into one thing. And so I just wanted to try and pull them apart a bit and say, there's the politicians and there's the fans, and they're two different sets of people. And the fans have never wavered in their support for the Beatles at all. That's the main thing.
That's a fascinating element of your book, in the sense that this thing happened, but I'm guessing the people that you spoke to and obviously others, their love for the band was unaffected by this experience. What was it like for them as the 60s went on? Did the Beatles' popularity change after this event? Did it expand? How psychedelic was the Philippines? What was that period like?
I think it got more. I mean, I think one fan I spoke to said that before they came, Paul was her favorite, and afterwards it was John. And she explained that by saying that she became more of an activist, more of a revolutionary in a way. It was someone who was agitating for peace and taking, marching as a student and protesting things the government are doing. So she was motivated to sort of take action by the Beatles and by, I guess, the things that John was doing later on as well. So I think for a lot of them it was that. I think for some it didn't diminish the dream of wanting to be in a band or of wanting to make music or of wanting to just express themselves through songs. So I think that didn't change. And one of the things, I mean, I keep noticing, and I know people directly whose parents named them after Beatles songs. I mean, there's one family, the eldest brother's called Sarge, the younger brother's called Kite, and then there's a Rocky in there, and and there's a Michelle. So there's people are just quite deep into Beatles folklore, and it's quite ingrained in the culture. So yeah, so I think honestly, this is the love for the band was undiminished. There was just this kind of slightly awkward thing of it didn't go well when they came, but there's no sense in which the fans or the people were ever caught up in any anti-Beatles stuff. That was all very much in this narrow sort of elite group, but really around maybe the people around the Marcuses as much as the Marcuses themselves.
To bring it up to now, as we head toward a conclusion, David, Paul and Ringo have, as we know, toured worldwide, but to date have not returned to the Philippines. Obviously, John and George didn't either, although, as you mentioned in the book, John's son, Julian, very much did.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of disappointment about that they have decided not to return? Do you think that their not coming back was tied into this direct experience, or is there other stuff at play here?
I don't know too much about how promoters and the band have discussed this, but there was a time when Ringo released his Postcards from Paradise album, as part of a campaign to send him postcards from the Philippines and see whether he would be interested. And there was enough. I think there were some conversations, but the thing now is that to bring, and I think Paul, you'd need a lot of money to guarantee to bring him in. But I think even with Ringo, you still need enough that promoters might worry about making it back. So there's the commercial side of it now, and I don't know whether there's enough enthusiasm among people to take that risk of, will Ringo sell out a big stadium? Is there enough power in wanting this story to have a resolution that the whole country can get behind this? I actually hope and would love there to be that there would be enough energy and backing to get Ringo back. I think at least, and just to say, look, it's 60 years on now.
Yeah,
I think I think whatever happened, we should be able to put it behind us, and there should be a happy conclusion to all of this. But I'm not sure whether that will happen. But I think that's the issue. But yeah, I think it's probably not a favorite place name to be raised up, when discussing an Asian tour, and they're probably thinking Japan, obviously been back many times, probably consider going to some of the other countries now, but Manila probably wouldn't ring happy bells in either of their hearts. But I think, yeah, it's one of those things. If enough people start to see the importance of it, of trying to get to some nice conclusion of it, certainly the older fans would love it, and there might be a new generation that would get behind the story. So yeah, it's my hope.
Well, that's a positive and hopeful way to end, David. We will remind listeners that the book is You Won't See Me, When the Beatles Ghosted Imelda. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.